Shalom, this is Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Acts chapter 25. This is going to be Paul before Festus. Father, we ask you to bless our study and have us be like the Bereans who receive the word with all eagerness, but who examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. By this teaching, enable each of us to be doers of your word and not just hearers only. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. As we work through this chapter, a lot of it's going to be repetitive, but there's a legal reason why I believe Luke is documenting all this. But for our case, let us observe how God is working behind the scenes to, A, prevent Paul from walking into an ambush, and then B, arrange it so that he will indeed appear before governors and kings and give a witness. When enemies try to block the gates of the gospel, God tends to open them wider, and that's what we see here. Jesus endured the wrath of mankind, and this is written in Psalm 76 on the screen. For the wrath of mankind shall actually praise you. You will encircle yourself with a remnant of wrath. So Genesis 50:20 says, what you meant for evil, God will use for good. And that's exactly the way things are going to play out for Paul here. As did Paul and many other believers who had falsehoods spoken against them, Jesus endured the wrath. And if Jesus did and Paul did, how can we think ourselves immune from the same today? We can expect the world's authorities to treat false charges against us with indifference and not justice. That's also a mark of something the early believers had to deal with. All right, Acts 25, verse 1. Festus then, arriving in the province, went to Jerusalem from Caesarea 3 days later. So recall that it's been 2 years since Paul was first brought to Caesarea. History records that Festus inherited a number of Felix's messes when he came to office. Paul was just one of these, and probably by far not the most significant. There were numerous cases of political intrigue, plots, assassination attempts. Some of those were successful that Festus had to wade through and deal with. Festus would have been based in Caesarea at the governor's residence, which is the old palace built by Herod the Great. And if you see in the foreground, there's that peninsula called a promontory. That's where his palace was. Paul's prison is usually considered to have been located in the same complex, but more towards the main city. Josephus records that Felix made it his business to punish those who made disturbances. He caught the majority of insurrectionists and killed a great many of them, and that's a quote from Josephus. Jerusalem had always been a hot spot and a headache for Roman officials. Likely Festus went to Jerusalem to acquaint himself with the religious and political situation there, being new on the job. One of the few structures that is still there today that Festus would have seen is the massive Temple Mount platform constructed by Herod the Great. It's 36 or 37 acres, and today it has the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on it. Much Herodian stonework from that construction is still visible today. So the things that Jesus and Paul and people like Festus saw, we can still see some of that today when we go to Jerusalem. Verses 2 and 3, and the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were pleading with Festus, requesting a concession against Paul that he might have brought him to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him along the way. John 15:20, remember the word I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you as well. If they follow my word, they will follow yours also. In the picture, you can see a reenactment of the Sanhedrin preparing to condemn Jesus, and there's a Roman soldier in the background. 2 years later, they're still threatened by Paul. They still want to continue their smear campaign. The Life Application Bible had a quote from William Walton: to carry a grudge is like being stung to death by one bee. That's just how hate festers. So our application here is better to deal with any unresolved anger in your life. Just get it out of the way, fix it. If not, it will continue to surface, and usually not at the best times. The Sadducees here are likely trying to capitalize on Festus's unfamiliarity with the case in general and Jewish law, case specific and Jewish law in general, by getting to him early. And they know that any new procurator is more likely to grant favors early on in their term to secure political loyalty. So they're trying to play on that. Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody in Caesarea and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, he said, have the influential men among you go there with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, have them bring charges against him. Festus was known to be much more honest and able than his predecessor Felix. He knew that Caesarea was the proper place for Paul to be tried. He might have had reason to be suspicious of the Jewish leaders depending on how much he had heard about them, be wary of landmines, that kind of thing, or he just may have simply been duty-bound. He knew it was the right thing to do. It does appear he was familiar enough with the case to know that Paul was a Roman citizen and had a right to be tried in a Roman court. But as a concession, he agreed to immediately reopen and try the case, even though I'm sure he would have had much more pressing matters to attend to. Scholars believe that the governor's residence in Caesarea was, again, that promontory place, and you can have a different view of it from looking at it from the ocean this time. And again, you can see the possible location of Paul's prison, the theater on the right, and then the hippodrome, the horse track, on the left. And recently they've excavated some areas beneath this. I think I talked about that on previous videos. So they think there's a whole another layer underneath what's visible today. After Festus had spent no more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea. Always go up to Jerusalem, and you always go down from Jerusalem. On the next day, he took a seat on the tribunal and ordered that Paul be brought. So this is official. Court is in session when he takes a seat on tribunal, which, by the way, is the bema seat, the judgment seat. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. You can bring serious charges, but if they don't hold water, then they're just wasting their breath. So taking his bema seat is the equivalent of everyone rises as a judge enters the courtroom. The official proceeding was in session. This is going to be contrasted with Agrippa and Bernice at the end of the chapter, which is not going to be a legal proceeding, but more of an informal hearing. These arguments here were likely identical to those by Tertullus in Acts 25. Luke spares us the details, but again summarizes that the charges were baseless. They apparently couldn't change their story because they had no facts in their favor. While Paul said in his own defense, I have done nothing wrong either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. So Paul reiterates the 3 specific charges of sedition, sectarianism, and blasphemy. He's not guilty of violating any Jewish or Roman law. We know he has the facts to back these up, even though Luke omits them, because they would have been the same facts as 2 years ago in Paul's defense before Felix. So Luke's already documented them. He doesn't need to document them again. And I can't resist pointing out that Paul's enemies accuse him of the same thing traditional Christian theology accuses Paul of. But Paul clearly states, I have done no wrong against the Torah. We're often taught that Paul did away with the Torah and he renounced Judaism. Here in Acts 25, he says no such thing. I have not done anything wrong against the Torah of the Jews. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, replied to Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? Festus could have ordered Paul to do this, but that would have been of questionable legality, so he asked Paul instead. Of course, Paul knows he's on the record, and whatever he says will be used against him. So if he waives his right to a Roman jurisdiction, then kind of the game is up, and Paul will be in deep trouble there. Paul's too smart for that. Potentially going to Jerusalem to stand trial in front of the Sanhedrin amounts to double jeopardy, and that is being tried for identical charges more than one session. According to the Jewish sages, the Torah asserts that if a person was previously found guilty in a court of law and new evidence is uncovered indicating the defendant is innocent, then the previously convicted person must be returned for a new trial because they could be innocent. However, if the defendant is acquitted and new evidence of potential guilt comes to light, then the case may not be reopened. And that's their stance on double jeopardy. We, of course, have a constitutional amendment prohibiting that double jeopardy in our case. In this situation, though, Paul, the defendant, was substantially acquitted by the Sanhedrin. and there's no new evidence, so the case should not have been reopened. And of course, we know it was never their intent to reopen the case. They wanted to kill him. Now, note the trials before Felix and then Festus would not constitute double jeopardy. Felix's departure effectively meant a mistrial at the end of that case at the end of chapter 24. And so now the case needs to be tried all over again. Festus and Paul may or may not have known about the ambush plot, but Paul's answer seems to indicate that he suspected something was highly improper about this request, and he replies accordingly. Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you also know very well." That's an interesting point there. "If, therefore, I am in the wrong and have committed something deserving death, I am not trying to avoid execution. But if there is nothing to the accusations which these men are bringing against me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." Big move, big bold move in Paul's case. Then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go." So Paul is not afraid here, and there's no fear either before Festus nor before standing before the ruler of the world, Caesar. So let Paul's conduct here be an inspiration to us. When we're afraid, when we get down, remember there is no fear because our Lord has already won the battle. Note verse 11, the more we are sold out for God, the more likely it is we will be accused by our enemies at some point in our lifetime. And like Paul, let us be found blameless on that day. Resist the urge to retaliate. Just speak the truth and trust God. So verse 11 is a good memory verse and a good life application verse here. In Acts 25, Paul appeals before a formal verdict is rendered. At least he appears to. And that seems premature. You always wait for an unfavorable decision, whether it's a verdict or a ruling during the trial, before you appeal. No one would appeal if they're actually winning. Paul summarizes this event, though, in Acts 28, and Luke adds a critical detail, and I find this fascinating. "I was handed over to the Romans as a prisoner." So he's in Rome now, and he's talking with the people. He's awaiting his hearing before Nero. "When they examined me, they were willing to release me, because there were no grounds for putting me to death. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any accusation against my nation," meaning it's just these small, group of ne'er-do-wells that my problem was with. It's not with the Jewish nation. "For this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and speak with you, since I am wearing this chain for the sake of the hope of Israel." And there's a whole backstory there that he's worried that they've heard bad things about Paul, and they actually haven't heard anything about this. But we'll get to that in Acts 28. But the point is here, if you only read Acts 25, it seems that Festus is being a little swampy and a little shady here, doing things under the table and maybe not above board. However, unlike the many Roman governors who ignored inconvenient rules, Josephus records that Festus was actually faithful in carrying out Roman policies. When we pull Acts 28 in, it supports this. So, I love this. Being a Berean isn't just good discipleship practice. It's also a lot of fun because we uncover nuggets and puzzles start to fit together more than they would if just reading a single passage. So, had some fun with this. In either case, Paul should have been freed. So, he may have been a capable administrator, but like Pilate before him, he should have released Jesus. Festus should have released Paul here. Festus is still somewhat of a coward. When Paul realized that this wasn't going to happen, he then invoked his right as a Roman citizen to request a trial in Rome. We might imagine that Paul looked something similar to this portrayal as he made his appeal. From my reading, it appears that in the late 50s, Nero was still relatively well respected and he was considered reasonable. People actually spoke hopefully of a golden age for Rome. He didn't develop his sadistic anti-Christian tendencies until the mid-60s. This is occurring in the year 59, so Paul had no reason at this point to think that Nero would not grant him a fair hearing. Appealing to Caesar, though, didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be heard before Nero. Civil cases were often dispatched by lower courts, and Nero could decide, he was the emperor, right? He could decide to reject the appeal or accept it, just like higher courts do today. In Paul's case, though, we believe he did get his audience before Nero. Not only was it a criminal trial, it was a high-profile case, as the new Jewish sect with Paul as its leader was on the rise, and Nero got a chance to hear him. One church tradition says Paul not only got to appear before Nero, he was acquitted by Nero. And that's fascinating. Usually we think of Paul imprisoned in Rome, and then that was the end. But actually, that's maybe not what happened. Paul's disciple Clement said Paul had gone to the extremity of the West before his martyrdom. To a first century Roman, the extremity of the West meant Spain. Jerome, who was the early church historian, also wrote Paul was dismissed by Nero that he might preach Christ's gospel in the West, as in Spain. So a lot of interesting takes here from church tradition. We'll look at more of these traditions and conjectures as we conclude Acts over the next couple of weeks. This is Palatine Hill, and it's where the Caesar's palaces would have been built. This is where Nero, not the Vegas hotel, but the actual Caesar's palace. This is where Nero would have resided when Paul made his appeal in this region here in Rome. Like today, we have the right of appeal, and like today, it probably was not automatic. It had to be, reviewed by the higher court and then accepted or rejected. Scholars disagree on this. Some people think that Roman citizens had an automatic guarantee of a hearing with Caesar if they requested it. In any case, the trial grinds to a halt once the appeal request is filed. There's no further hearings or anything like that. It's done until the emperor decides on a timetable here. Based on Festus's conference, so he probably conferred with some legal experts. They were probably discussing the merits of the appeal. And again, appealing before a verdict was given probably would not have been permitted. And this lends some weight to the fact that Festus likely made some indication that Paul was innocent, just as Acts 28 records. In any case, Festus, I'm sure politically, was glad to approve this so he could extract himself from the case and its political pressures and kind of be done with it. Now, when several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice, or we might say Bernike, she's named after Nike, the goddess of victory, they arrived in Caesarea paying their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus presented Paul's case to the king, saying, "There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix," so blaming his predecessor there, it's kind of fun. "And when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him." Who was Agrippa II? Well, he was the last of the line of the Herods. His great-grandfather was Herod the Great, who was the ruler at the time Jesus was born. His uncle was Herod Antipas, who was the Herod of Jesus' adult ministry. And his father, Agrippa I, is the one who killed James and imprisoned Peter. So a long line of Herods finally coming to an end here. Bernice, again in English, probably pronounced more like Bernike after Nike, the goddess of victory, was not Agrippa's wife. She was his sister and consort. And their incestuous relationship was actually the talk of Rome, and it was a big scandal in that day. Drusilla was the sister and was married to the former governor Felix. So all of this family dynamics is really happening here. They arrived at Caesarea with all of the pomp and ceremony that their ego and status demanded. She wasn't formally the queen, but ultimately she becomes the queen, as you can see on the plaque there. It says Regina Bernike, Queen Bernike. The two likely spent many days getting Festus up to speed on politics and the landmines that Festus's predecessors probably tripped over. Things like don't put any graven images on the Temple Mount. Don't let your soldiers, transgress the temple threshold. And they probably said, don't trust the Sadducees. They're a bunch of trouble. And that's the situation he's in now, is because he's listening to the Sadducees and taking them at their word when he's probably realizing what they say is probably not exactly the truth. Festus here probably realized he had a lot to learn. And eventually, as they're discussing these things, the matter of Paul came up. And he realized that he needed Agrippa's advice. Like any good politician, again, he blames Felix, his predecessor, which is very, very typical. I replied to them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any person before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled there, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered that the man be brought. Remember, there's a speculation that Luke is recording documents for Paul's appeal, this appeal that he just made. If so, then this conversation between Festus and Agrippa would have been very relevant testimony, even though though from our perspective it is redundant because it's recapping events that had just happened earlier in Acts 25. When the accuser stood up, they did not begin bringing charges against him of any crimes, as I suspected, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And being at a loss as how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial on these matters. So being at a loss is interesting here. Being new to the scene, Festus probably did not have an appreciation for Judaism and the different sects, including the wide chasm between Sadducees, Pharisees, and Messiah followers, how they just didn't get along. Sadducees are the aristocracy class. They didn't want, didn't want their ship rocked, their boat rocked or anything like that. What they presented to him was a matter of insurrection and revolution. But when he peeled back the onion, it turns out to be just whether Jesus, who had died, was alive. And that's really what it's all about. Now, for us, spiritually, that's the main thing. But for him, these were just theological charges, and they did not belong in a Roman court. He would gladly welcome Agrippa's opinions on the issue. When Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, our order that he be kept in custody until I sent him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. That Jesus was alive was the heart of Paul's faith and testimony. This is a plaque from the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. Jesus Christ declared with power to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead, Romans 1:4. And as we approach Easter, recording this right before Easter, that is what it's all about. It is all about the resurrection. That is what Paul is laying his life on the line to testify to and to defend. Before Paul's transformation on the Damascus Road, he persecuted the followers of Jesus and denied that Jesus was the living Messiah. Now, Paul himself is being persecuted for exactly those things. And, you have to appreciate the irony there. As a free man also, Paul never had these opportunities to witness like this. It's only when he was imprisoned that he got an audience before governors and kings, just as Jesus said in Matthew 10:18. We are reminded to look for opportunities amidst crisis. When things aren't going our way, we tend to kind of get down and say, why is this happening to me? But as the Life Application Bible says, Paul saw this new audience as yet another opportunity to present the gospel. And then the challenge here, rather to complain about your present circumstances, look for ways to use every situation to serve God and to share him with others. Your problems may actually be opportunities in disguise. And again, that's the Life Application Bible. So on the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice came amid great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought before them. You always see, more often than not, Agrippa and Bernice or Bernike mentioned together. And Luke is probably reminding us here of the moral depravity of the so-called king. This is more like a party or a festival than a hearing, somewhat reminiscent of Jesus' appearance before Herod Antipas. Paul had already made his appeal, so he was not required to defend himself before Agrippa. He had already appealed to Caesar. So Paul's going to use this opportunity as a chance to share his testimony. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen present with us, you see this man about whom the people of the Jews appealed to me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he committed nothing deserving death, and since he himself appeals to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord, to the Caesar. Therefore I brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. So the matter is not insignificant. Paul is accused of being a threat to good order and discipline, and that's something Rome took very seriously. But since Paul appealed, Festus can now freely admit without repercussion that he believed the accusations were meritless, and this is something Luke gladly noted. Festus is only partially out of the woods, though. Despite having the headache removed from his plate, there are still no Roman charges to write in an official report. And that's going to make Festus look very foolish if he doesn't have something to accompany him. He's likely hoping that Agrippa, with his Jewish background, can help him and help write the report for him, basically. In the best case, best outcome will be that Agrippa agrees that Paul is innocent. And in that case, Festus could release Paul, and he'd be better protected from complaints. If both the king and the procurator agree that someone's innocent, then go away. You've got no standing here. Paul would then be persuaded to drop his appeal, and everyone except the Sadducees would be happy in that case. Since Paul is not required to defend against charges, as we mentioned, he's going to share his testimony. Luke's going to record that in great detail, and we'll get to that along with Agrippa's very sad response to it in Acts 26. And so we'll see you next time along the Talmidim way.